Well, good morning. Sorry you weren't able to join me. I imagine the rain and the storm had something to do with that. I hope you all are well. I wanted to make a few announcements before I start. First, I've posted the images on the resources link on the Blackboard course, the images that I'm using in this presentation, and I will repost the full PowerPoint with the images in as well. Next time, you should be starting to read, maybe even finished, chapters 4 and 5. You should, of course, review this video, and you should be prepared to discuss the first 3 chapters in class. If you have any questions next time about the first 3 chapters and the topics that we have addressed, that would be the time to do it. There are no stupid questions. In teaching a course like this, we can only take 1 or maybe 2 topics at a time, and so at any particular presentation, we're leaving a lot of material out. Material that relates even directly to the topic that we're discussing. So there are no stupid questions. If you have questions or things that I didn't explain adequately, I'd like to know that so I can try to do it again a little bit better. If you have questions about your paper assignment, you should be asking them in class next time. Keep in mind that I did post an announcement which extended the deadline for submitting the first paper assignment, several days. With regard to the paper assignment, again, let me stress that whenever possible, you should be using academic sources. Those are available, among other places, at the Ivy Tech Library online. It's important to remember that there are a couple decent media sources, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. Hang on one second. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I just started recording and gave some instructions for the students regarding reading, regarding the class next time. So please take a look at the recording when Ms. Kuzin posts it, which should be tomorrow, because there is some information in there that would be of use to the students with respect to class next week, which would be Tuesday. Has the weather kind of made things a little more difficult this morning?
Yeah.
I can't see the class. Are most of the students there?
Yeah. 3, 4.
Okay, there I can see you. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and again, for those who are not there, the recording will be posted tomorrow. We've only got about 25 minutes, so I need to hustle a little bit because I want to make sure and finish this particular chapter so that we're done with the first 3 chapters next time. But if you do have questions or there's material that I'm not explaining very adequately, please interrupt me and ask away. So last time we were talking about the increase in the transfer of federal government monies to state and local governments and how that changed federalism from a kind of dual federalism to what political scientists call marble cake federalism, and so there was a great increase starting really after World War II is when it really began, and even more after 1960. And one of the reasons, as I suggested, is that state budgets are weak, and so the federal government has been helping out states and localities. And this image is a reflection of the change in the shift towards central government spending as a part of overall government spending between 1927 and 1940. Of course, a lot of that has to do with World War II. State governments and local governments weren't spending for that, but the national government obviously was. So one of the questions one might ask is, well, why don't states and local governments do more? And this starts to get into very complicated issues. And sometimes political scientists use the term competitive federalism to explain it. Why don't state and local governments do more? If they do more, they provide more services and more benefits to residents. They can't just invent money out of the air. The federal government can print money, state and local governments can't. And so states and local governments need to levy taxes on residents and sometimes businesses in order to raise revenues so that they can function, deliver services, and provide amenities to citizens who live in their community and in their state. The problem is that, as you may know, states tend to compete with one another. In the news in the past week, there were news articles about how Nevada, the state of Nevada, won the state competition for a new Tesla factory. So states and localities compete against one another, and in order to do that, most local and state political officials, not all, but many, believe that they need to have a favorable business climate. All other things being equal, what do you think would happen in Indiana if the governor and legislature said, well, we think we don't have enough money, so we're going to raise the state income tax by 50%, and we're going to raise the state income tax on businesses by 75%. Assuming everything else remains the same, which of course it wouldn't, but assuming that, what would be one of the possible consequences? Well, one of the consequences would be that people or businesses that could afford to leave the state might consider it or might actually do it. So state and local governments and their officials tend to hold to the view that it's important that they maintain a tax rate that's as low as possible, a tax burden that's as low as possible, even if it means that all the potholes don't get filled, the lights don't always go on, parks don't get taken care of, schools maybe aren't quite what they ought to be because they don't want to lose higher income residents, nor do they want to lose businesses. And so state governments, and keep in mind too, state and local governments can't tax as robustly, just in terms of the number and range of taxes that they can levy compared to the federal government. So I want to show you a couple images as I talk about federalism, because there's an interplay, and this is complicated stuff. There's an interplay between the federal system, political parties, and who controls in Washington and which party controls in the states, and public policy. So this is a current image of where Republicans have one-party rule in the states. These are red states. And in the other states, they don't have one-party rule, by the way, means that both the governor and the state legislature are Republican-controlled. And I'm not capable enough to put these on one. I mean, I could, but it would take a while to put them on one slide. So, but you should compare the two maps I'm going to show. So that's where Republicans are in control in the red states. So this is an example of how the federal system and party control can have an impact on public policy. By the way, you can all. So if we look at this chart, what this chart is a current. The source is Kaiser Health News, which is a very reliable source on health policy, and what it shows is what states have what kind of exchange for the Affordable Care Act. So, interestingly, in the states where the Republicans have the governorship, almost all of those states refused or declined to create a state health exchange. Just a very few did. Almost all of them said, okay, federal government, you do it. A few states, looks to be about 7, said, okay, we're going to partner with the federal government. And most of those states had Democratic governors. That's the blue. And the states that created their own exchange were, the great majority, perhaps 3/4, were either had a Democratic governor or an independent governor. And so what you see is very different political and policy behavior depending on which party is in power in the state. Here is another example, again taken from very current. This is current as of about 2 weeks ago. And Indiana actually has been in the news on this matter. So the Affordable Care Act provided an extension of Medicaid coverage for lower income people, and actually increased the income a household could have and still be covered by Medicaid. And for the first 3 years, this is 100% covered by federal funds, 0 funds from the states. And so what you see in the darker green is the states under the Affordable Care Act have the choice as to whether or not they actually signed on to Medicaid expansion. So what you can see is that the darkest green or the brightest green states did agree to the Medicaid expansion provided by the federal funds, and Utah, Missouri, and Indiana have been considering it and may in fact do it eventually, though initially they declined. But then look at the states in gray that have not approved this expansion. And basically what it means is that there's a whole lot of people in the gray states who have low and modest incomes who are not going to be provided health care because the governors refused to take the hundreds of millions of dollars of funds from the federal government to pay for that coverage. So then what I want you to do is take a look at this map here, the gray and green map, and compare it to the first map we looked at in terms of party control. And you'll see that there's a pretty good overlap between the gray areas in this map and the red areas in that map. Okay. So, about probably the best book, from my point of view, ever written about American politics is a little book that's over 50 years old by a guy with a very long name, but mercifully for students, he wrote a very short book. His name is E.E. Schatzschneider, And the book is called The Semi-Sovereign People, and it's, I think, discussed a bit in the textbook. And if one looks at his approach to analyzing American politics, one can apply that as well to an understanding of federalism. Simply put, he believed that, and he defined democracy as the socialization of conflict. What does this mean? If you'll recall, at the beginning of the course, we talked about one of the major decisions that political systems have to make is the decision about whether an issue facing the nation should be decided by government, whether it should be decided in the private sector, or some combination thereof. And the socialization of conflict for Schachtschneider meant and means that an issue that involves conflict between people, groups, communities, states, what have you, companies, businesses, begins to move from the non-governmental realm to the governmental realm. So the federalism as a structure of government can be understood as a vehicle of party strategy and policy strategy. Well, in general, and you need to be careful with generalizations, political conservatives and Republicans tend to be, they're not quite the same, tend to be associated with the with views about the importance of states' rights. Liberals, many of whom are Democrats, and Democrats tend to be more associated with the idea that the national government should have a greater role in policy making and decision making in our society. Where does this come from? It comes from what we talked about last time in terms of the changes that have occurred in American society, and more specifically, it's this view of a new and somewhat expanded role for the national government comes from the American experience of the New Deal in dealing with the Depression. So, the tradition of believing in a greater domestic policy role for the national government derives from and is reflected in the New Deal, is reflected in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty program in the 1960s. It basically holds to the view that our society, and that Great Depression represents this in part, the liberal, quote-unquote, liberal view rests on the belief that at certain times, and maybe because of the complexity of our society, most times, the nation's domestic needs have increased so much that the role of the federal government must be expanded to meet or to try to at least respond to those needs. So one can argue, and this is more Ellison than Schachtschneider, though the former rests in part on the latter. Sometimes I describe federalism as a three-ring circus. Maybe some of you have been to the circus. And there are multiple things going on. There are multiple rings where circus performers and animals and God knows what else are involved in doing all kinds of things. And so that is a kind of metaphor for our American government, because we also have multiple arenas. We often call them levels of government, but they're really different arenas of political life and policy making, and they're interrelated, but they're also distinct. So we have a federal government, we have state governments, we have local governments. So what does this mean? Well, one of the things it means, I think, is that anytime, and of course we also have legislative, executive branch, and judiciary. One of the things it means is anytime anybody makes a political or a policy decision, there is an arena of government where the losers can appeal. In other words, if a group or an organization or a community or a state or a business loses a decision, or a citizen loses a policy decision, they don't necessarily, in fact, infrequently, do they just go home and say, oh, well, I lost, I'll move on and do something else. No, that's not what happens, especially if a group or organization has resources. They look for a new way to achieve their policy goal. And so that's why I define, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I think it's as realistic as anything else, democracy, at least in the United States, as a political system where nothing is finally settled. Because there's always a place to appeal. You may lose the appeal, but people in office change, judges change, governors change, political culture, political climate, and political opinion change over time. One of the things that federalism does as well is it tends to emphasize, allow actors to emphasize how and where policy decisions should be made. Because we don't just have a unitary system, we have a federal system, we have federal government, state government, and local government. And in the next slide, I talk about this as a two-step policy process. This is one of the reasons, the federal system is one of the reasons things move so slow and are rarely permanently settled. Why? Because first of all, folks who are on the think that they're on the losing side of a policy debate, or who are trying to get a more favorable decision, will start asking the question, well, who really has the authority to make a policy or to pass a law in this area? Is it the federal government? Is it the state government? Is it the local government? When folks ask that question, what they are doing is creating a procedural obstacle to addressing the fundamental or substantive policy question. If every time there's a policy or a legal matter, the first question is not what should the policy be, but who should make the decision, that then precedes substantive policy debate and decision making. And so you can look at a number of policy areas. I just put down a few that have been very controversial, have generated a lot of policy and political conflict in these multiple arenas, in the federal government, in the state governments, and local governments, but also between the branches, the executive branch, the legislative, and the judiciary. And one thing I think is fairly clear about policy conflict and political conflict in the United States, and that is that people or actors involved in politics seek a policy decision venue or arena where the array of participants is likely to produce a policy outcome that's favorable to their point of view. So, because the local political officials are different from state political officials. State political officials are different from federal political officials. The Congress of the United States is different from the Indiana State Legislature, and is different from, the city council or commission in Indianapolis. So all political actors seek to find the venue that is most likely to conform to their policy preference. So I have 2 more slides left. Okay. So the War on Poverty and the New Deal both involve a great deal of intergovernmental relations between the federal government and federal policy on the one hand, and state and local governments and policy on the other. So you can look at a number of policy issues and federal programs, and I want to try to, I don't have a lot of time, I want to try to just provide you an overview, because this is one reason why there is difference between the two political parties. The tendency up through the 1960s was as federal funding for state governments increased through grant and aid programs. The basic idea behind the New Deal and the War on Poverty was there are serious domestic policy issues in our country that the federal government has to address. These, everything from segregation to denial of voting rights, poverty, all kinds of things. Well, one of the things, I'm going to skip over the reapportionment piece, I'll pick it up another time. That perspective, that view that we really do have important and critical national policy needs has been under attack for 45 years. And a number of and political scientists refer to this sometimes as devolution, the idea of moving power for domestic policy making from the federal government to the state governments. Two of the best federal program examples of this occurred initially under the Nixon administration. This block grants continued thereafter, even into Clinton and beyond. Revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was a federal program under which the federal government sent money to the state governments. And the Congress voted, we're not going to tell you what to do with the money. Here's the money. Okay, state and local officials, you decide. We have no national needs. You just decide how you want to use the money. Block grants, CDBG was the Community Development Block Grant Program, passed in 1974 by the Congress. That began a series of laws passed by the Congress that provided block grants, which again, to the state and local governments, which again provided much greater flexibility as to how, for state and local officials, as to how the monies were to be spent. And so basically what the federal system allows is a series of almost never-ending conflicts over domestic policy and whether the federal government should have a major role in addressing national policy needs, or even whether we have them. Those who say, well, we really don't have them, or the federal government really isn't very good at doing this, their position tends to be that, you know, if the states want to do something, they're really closer to the action and what's going on in their state anyway, rather than have the federal government make a policy or develop a program. It's just better to give the states autonomy and funds and let them do what they want. And so that's a major political conflict that federalism enables. So what are the political consequences of federalism? Some of them are enduring intergovernmental tensions. That is to say, states and the federal government often, sometimes agree, more often than not, they don't. Secondly, there are multiple access or veto points in our governmental system. You don't like what a legislative body did, go to the courts. You don't like what a state government did, go to the federal government, and so on. So there's always a place to go to try to get your policy view accepted into law. What this does, among other things, is it makes change difficult. I alluded to the two-step policy conflict a minute ago. What does this two-step policy conflict mean? What it means is that before you can decide what a policy or law should be, folks in politics, political actors, ask, should the government do this? And if so, should the national government do it? Should state governments do it? Should local governments do it? Or some combination thereof? And that's even before you get to the substance of the issue. So that makes policy change slow down. Because first, you have to agree on where it's going to be done. And sometimes there is no agreement, and things go on simultaneously. One example of that is gay marriage, somewhere where the Congress 6 or 7 years ago actually voted on a constitutional amendment which would have prohibited it, and it lost, and then obviously other things happened. Gay marriage is a critique of my argument. What does that mean? Well, my view is that if one wants policy change, and if the Constitution provides appropriate authority for the federal government, it's easier to get policy or political change through the federal government than state government. Why is that the case? More often than not. Very simply, if you get a federal law passed, you only have to go to one place to get a change in federal policy. Okay, that's supposed to cover the whole country. If you go the state route, then you have to go state by state. We have 50 states. So I know we're out of time here, but the bottom line is it easier to get a change at one institution or a change at 50 institutions? This is really a math question. And then the answer, I think, is pretty simple. That is to say, it's always easier to get change at one place than at 50. Now, the critique of my argument is gay marriage, where basically the federal government did nothing and it went state by state. And what changed here in the gay marriage issue is the involvement of the courts. It was taken to some degree out of the policy or the partisan political process and made a judicial question. And so that is, in that sense, and that's gone state by state, and so that's a kind of critique of the argument that I just made. I know we're out of time. Please review this video so that you can see what I said about preparing for class on Tuesday. Have a good rest of the week and weekend. And if you have questions, you can also message me or post something on the discussion board on Blackboard. Take care. Bye-bye.